Lacey. I am ChildNet's Career Development Manager, and I will be going over with you an overview of the concepts for the child welfare practice model. And as you can see, our focus for today will be on caregiver protective capacities. I'd like to go ahead and also let you know we have a couple of objectives as well as agendas, and we've broken it down into two components. The first component that we're going to go over is an overview of the process and the assessments that are completed within the child welfare practice model. We're doing this so that you can have a high-level understanding of how the caregiver protective capacities are identified. As noted, it will include a basic understanding of the family dynamics as well as the information collection. After we complete that first component, the second component will be a deeper dive into the information within the caregiver protective capacities. I will probably be frequently referring to this as CPCs. We will then go over a review and we will discuss an example of a diminished protective capacity situation, as well as what some examples of an enhanced protective capacities may look like. So we're going to go ahead and jump in with the first section. Before we do that, I also want to let you know the child welfare practice model is extremely intensive. So we will not be covering the following items today. Safety planning, and that includes danger threats, present and impending danger, as well as safe and unsafe. We will also not be discussing in-depth safety plan analysis and/or conditions for return, nor will we be going in deep with child needs. Again, we will touch on these for high level, but they will not be covered today. All right, so when a case starts, it starts off and the process begins at the hotline. The first group or area to assess the family is the hotline. What they do is they seek to screen in cases where there's reported information in which indicates a maltreatment may have occurred and/or there may be indications that the child may be unsafe due to present or impending danger. When a call is made into the hotline, if it is assessed that there is potential maltreatment and/or the child may be unsafe, they screen it in. When they screen the call in, that call then gets transferred over to the Child Protective Investigation. In Broward, the Child Protective Investigation is completed by the Broward Sheriff's Office. The Broward Sheriff's Office, or CPI located in a different area, reaches out to the family and they complete, as with many other assessments and indicators with the family, a family functioning assessment. The family functioning assessment that they complete is used to collect what is determined as sufficient information to determine if there is present and impending danger, as well as what are the family's caregiver protective capacities. They also establish and monitor sufficient safety plans if those are needed. After the case is determined to be unsafe and there is impending danger and the family needs ongoing case management services, the case is then transferred to the local community-based care and its case management providers. In Broward and Palm Beach, that is ChildNet. When the case is transferred over from the protective investigations to case management is responsible for doing several initial as well as ongoing assessments to identify and make sure the family is receiving the services they need. The first service and/or assessment that is completed with the family is called a family functioning assessment, and it's called ongoing in case management, and it's also called a progress updates. This is where the case manager engages the caregivers to facilitate change. It is led by the family because they are the experts of the situation and the environment that's going on. So we do promote self-determination and raise self-awareness regarding the impending danger and their caregiver protective capacities. At this FFA, we also establish goals for change with the family to focus on the individualized service plan. We also monitor and update safety plans during the family functioning assessment and/or progress update. In addition, case management must always monitor the safety plans, and they have to develop and monitor the case plan as well. The safety plan and case plan evaluation are important because, again, here we promote the personal choice and we have the ongoing raising of self-awareness. Our responsibility is to assess the effectiveness of change and whether the services are addressing the permanency goals. And for the safety management, we are always assessing the status of the impending danger, the safety plan analysis, and we are identifying if we are working with the least intrusive safety plan for the family that we can. This stage of safety plan and case plan evaluation also focuses on progress related to permanency goals for change and to enhance diminished caregiver protective capacities. The final assessment of this case management process is called case closure. At this juncture, and as stated, it is the closure process for the family. During this case closure, we are still assessing for child safety, permanency, and well-being. Our goal here at case closure is to identify any absence of impending danger and to ensure that there are routinely demonstrated enhanced protective capacities to assure that a child is protected from danger and that if there is danger, the caregivers can provide for the needs of their children. So, now that we have a very high level kind of overview of what assessments are completed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into a component within the family assessment and progress update, as well as stuff that we look for when we are working with our family. And it's just an overall arching concept of understanding family dynamics and what that means, especially related to the assessments and the enhanced capacities that we're going to be discussing. So, in the process of understanding the family dynamics, it's important that we understand the process and thoroughly work through information collection with our families, as well as other collaterals. So what does that mean? It means we're focused on what are we hearing? What are we observing? What is the family saying? What are providers saying and those that are working with the families? What is being observed? It's important when we're working with the families and we're trying to get this information to appropriately identify both enhanced and diminished capacities. We need to also understand on the back end that we know what information we have to learn about a family. The information collection is critical because there are several elements of the family functioning assessment in which we must identify and collect various forms of information, we call them domains, so that we can best serve our families and help them identify some of the areas they have to work on. Now, another component of information collection is so that the person understands the purpose or the reasons for needing to know this information. We're not just collecting information to fill up the paper. We're getting information so that we can have a better understanding of the day-to-day and or the aspects of that family. What makes them who they are? We want to try to get as much information both on their successes as well as some struggles We want to see whether or not this is a single incident. Is it something that is occurring only once, or is it severe and occurring on an ongoing basis? And we on our end need to understand the purposes and the reasons behind all of this. So as our staff go out, it is our understanding, as well as theirs, that when they're in this process and engaging with the families, that they understand and demonstrate and have an awareness that everything that they do to reconcile and validate the information that they are receiving will absolutely influence the overall quality of the information. You know, we, as mentioned earlier, reach out to the family because they are the experts of what is going on. So it is important for us to really listen and collect the information that we are given from them. But it's also important for us to demonstrate that awareness of when we also have to reconcile and validate. Is the information that they're giving us accurate? Is it almost accurate? Or do we need to maybe go back and clarify because something is missing? And that is really important because what we are about to put into our family assessments and our progress updates, as well as safety plans and case plans, is from the quality that we're able to obtain from our families. Okay, so we've gone out there, we've gotten the information from our families, we understand the purpose, we know why, we are reconciling and validating the information that's coming in. But the other component too, and just as critical as the previous slides, is the information logically and succinctly collected and written in a way that justifies the conclusions. We'll get into what that means a little bit later when we talk about what goes in each of these domains. But again, it is important for you to understand that information collection, a large component is that the person that's collecting it can also discuss and write about it logically and succinctly. And again, it needs to justify any of the recommendations that they are moving forward with. Okay, the next slide. The next slide is sufficient. And what we frequently tell our staff and people in the community is the information is sufficient when you feel like you have a complete picture of what's going on. Now, if you look at the slide in front of you, we can tell this is probably a dog. But do we know for sure what type? Do we know if there are any other issues going on with the dog? Do we know if there's any special needs that we may have to keep in mind? No, we can't tell because we're missing some of those pieces. So right now, this would be an example of an insufficient amount of information for me. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig a little deeper underneath sufficient for our information collection. And we've highlighted some key things in red. So I just want to make sure that we go over everything so that you guys understand. For the purposes of our information collection as it currently stands underneath the child welfare practice, information collection is considered sufficient when it fully describes what has or is happening in each domain. And I will get into those domains in just a moment. It provides a clear picture and an accurate understanding without having to refer to additional material. So what that means is we should be treating that family functioning assessment or that progress update as a singular document. People should be able to look at that document and have a clear idea of what is or has happened without having to refer to other materials. It's also essential that we have at least to the best of our information collection, a complete picture of each domain. Now, may there be some times where we may not have all of the information in a domain, maybe because somebody is not as forthcoming or they may not be present at the moment, perhaps. But again, this is a complete picture of the domain from the information we are gathering. Sufficient also means it adequately describes the roles of the persons in the home or the family resource network. So what that means is if there are two adults in the home, are they both caregivers? Is there one primary caregiver? Is there one person that is just there renting out a space and they have no role within the home? Or are they babysitters or temporary visiting? But it is important that it adequately describes the role of the persons in the home. Also, it needs to provide a clear and rationale for the decisions that we're making with respect to the enhanced protective capacities, the safety plan actions, and all of the other supports that we identify as it relates to the impending danger and the diminished caregiver protective capacities. We need to ensure that everything that's written in there provides a clear rationale for what we're doing for this family. And as you can see now, I do have a clear picture. I can see this cute little dog, and I can see that it has two bright eyes looking back at me. It has some dog tags. Its ears are fully there. It doesn't look like there's any bumps, bruises, marks, or any additional things I may need to be looking for in his overall character. But again, as with this, I still don't maybe know what may be going on medically or if he's on a special diet. But at least from the physical component, I do now have a clear picture. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dig a little deeper into some of the components of the family functioning assessment. Again, it's just going to be a very high-level overview so that you have a basic understanding of what the family functioning assessment is. And then we'll do a little deeper dive on our focus topic of protective capacities. All right. The overall arching goal of the family functioning assessment is to identify whether the child or children are safe or unsafe. If the child is safe, there is no longer a need for services. If the child is identified as unsafe, then we continue to proceed through the child welfare practice model and provide services, supports, and ongoing assessment to move that from unsafe to safe. The safe and unsafe is identified as a combination of what is the danger threat, along with the information we have collected within the domains, as well as the capacities that we assessed, so they're caregiver protective capacities. And those three items are what we do to determine whether or not the child is safe or unsafe. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start off and I'm going to show you next what a danger threat is, or at least the verbiage for a danger threat. Danger threats are various threats that are actually occurring or may occur for the child. My apologies if it doesn't show up very clear, if it's not large enough on your screen, but there are 11 of them. The 11th one, which is at the bottom, is other. That's rarely used because most of the danger threats that are occurring within the child and the family's environments are usually encaptured by the previous 10. Now, I can tell you that frequently you will see the caregiver is violent, impulsive, or acting dangerously in ways that seriously harmed the child or will likely seriously harm the child. That is the danger threat that's slightly more than halfway down on the screen in front of you in the blue color. That one is frequently used when there's the danger threat of domestic violence, substance, and or persons acting in impulsive ways. We do also see quite frequently that the caregiver is not meeting the child's basic and essential needs, but I did just want to highlight with you the two that we see frequently, but there are a total of 11, although the 11th one, which is other, is really rarely used. I actually have not seen a reason for the other since we've had the child welfare practice. Okay, now the next one, we're going to go a little bit deeper as to what are the components that make up the FFA. I was mentioning earlier that the three areas that determine whether the child is safe or unsafe is the danger threats, which I just very briefly went over, and the next one is the domains. So we're about to go into the domains now. There are a total of 6 to 7 domains, but the reason I say 6 to 7 is because when you're writing the maltreatment and you're writing the surrounding circumstances, 4 of the domains are merged together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over each one of these domains, and then I'm going to let you know, if you were to look at an assessment, which one of these domains would be grouped together and which one of them are on their own. The first domain that pulls up on the family functioning assessment, as well as the progress update, is the extent of maltreatment. The extent of maltreatment is the what is occurring or what has occurred in the home. What are the results of what has occurred? So what that means is the extent of the maltreatment would be the actual maltreatment itself. So was there allegations of substance abuse, domestic violence, and then what were the results of those? What were the investigative findings? That's what would go in here. Underneath the extent of maltreatment, that is only completed by the Child Protective Investigations. It is not completed, and it is grayed out as an area or a domain that case management is not able to complete. So after extent of maltreatment, the next one is the surrounding circumstances. Now, both the extent of maltreatment and the surrounding circumstances, if you were to look at the family assessment or progress update, are linked together in the same section on the assessment, which is why I said I would let you know if there are 2 domains that are merged together, because it looks like it is a single section, but it is actually 2 separate domains. So underneath this circumstance, this domain actually really takes a deeper dive into the extent of maltreatment, which is why they also link it. It wants to know what are the surrounding circumstances to that maltreatment, to that event, to what's going on. So this section, it's supposed to explain what is going on with the home or the family that led up to, or what was surrounding the incident. What are the provided explanations by the household members and collaterals of how these circumstances occurred or are occurring? This section also talks about, and should talk about, is there a history of this type of circumstance? Does this family have an ongoing circumstance of the same substance or maltreatment, or was it an isolated event or an accident? And then also this section should talk about what was the intent of the maltreating caregiver. So it is kind of easy to see how these 2 sections, when you see them on the assessment, are linked together. All right, the next one, or the third domain, and the third one that you'd see is an individual domain called child functioning. This one is separated and focuses on the children in the placement. It looks at how the child functions on a day-to-day basis. It also should capture what the current status as well as the current needs, rather than what the child could do at a specific point in time. It also should be qualified by the age of the child and or any special needs or developmental delays. So this section really goes through a lot of different areas, and I put them up on the screen for you. But it should touch on their general behavioral patterns, their emotions, their temperament, their development, their academic status as applicable, their physical capability, as well as their health status. Again, and I'm going to just switch it back to the slide before. It's taking a look at how the child functions on a day-to-day basis in those areas specific to what they are currently doing, as far as what is their status, what are their needs, which is qualified by age and or special need or developmental delay. So it's very important that if, for example, you have a child who does have some cognitive or developmental delays, that you address that and notate that in there, and then you adjust when you're working with your family to see if that is appropriate for that child's special needs or any type of developmental delays. Okay, so the next section is adult functioning. The adult functioning looks at how the adult functions on a day-to-day basis. If you see that little character on the screen, that is kind of a very vague representation of all of the aspects we are trying to capture underneath this for the adult. This section talks about how a day in the life of them, or a week in the life, looks like, and it's our responsibility to capture it. As we're going through this domain, we also need to consider what their protective capacities or lack of protectiveness appears to be, and what we can hear and see and observe, and document that. We also need to, within this section, document how does their day-to-day functioning impact their ability to parent. The caregiver protective capacities, remember, it looks at their ability to parent and protect their child. How does this adult get along with the other household members? How do the roles and responsibilities within the household, how are they divided? How does each member or each adult, do they understand their aspect and their role and responsibility in caring for the children? What are their relationships with family members outside of the household? That should also be described so that we, again, have the best understanding that we can of this adult's functioning. And then, of course, this section also should be describing what stage of change the parent is with respect to caring for their child, and how you determined what stage of change your parent is at. So it should not just say, for example, they are in pre-contemplation. It should say they are in pre-contemplation, and then have all of the information as to how they came to that decision. The next domain is parenting domain. This domain refers to the style of a parenting that they have adopted and where they got that style from. This section also talks about the expectations and wishes that they have for their children, as well as how do they perceive each of their children. Are their children seen as a burden, or is it this parent's perception positive of their child? This parenting domain section also describes historical and present parenting practices and behaviors that the caregiver has experienced. Now, I'm going to briefly move forward to the next one, and I may toggle back and forth very briefly just to let you know that the last domain is called the discipline domain. Now, in the family functioning assessment, you're also going to see this discipline and the parenting domain linked together. It is one single section of the family assessment. Okay, so in the beginning, you had the maltreatment and surrounding circumstances. Those are together in the family assessment. Then you had the child functioning, the adult functioning, and then you have the parenting and the discipline. And again, the parenting and discipline are together. Okay, so there are a total of 6, but it looks like when people read it, sometimes they feel like there are 4, because again, the first 2 and these last 2 are combined. Now, the discipline domain is about teaching and guiding the child. So in here, we need to capture how the parent is teaching and guiding their child. Discipline is, while some people typically think it as a negative consequence or some type of punishment, it is not. Discipline in the child practice model really focuses on what kind of direction, managing behavior, and teaching are you providing to the child. So we want to find out what are their disciplinary methods, what approaches have they used to managing the child's behaviors, what is their perception of the effectiveness of the tools they are utilizing in their approach to disciplining their child, and what are the concepts and the purpose of the discipline? Are they disciplining just to discipline, or is there a concept or a purpose behind, a teaching concept behind what they're doing? And what is the context in which the discipline occurs? Also, it is very important to make sure that we are reaching out and we have a full understanding if there's any type of cultural practice that may also give some light as to the concepts, the purpose, the context, and any other type of teaching and guiding that is going on. Okay, so now that we've gone over the 6 domains, which are captured in 4 categories inside the family assessment, the next assessment section deals with the caregiver protective capacities. While I have the screen up here, I'm not going to go into detail right now because I will actually go into this slide again a little bit later. So I'm just going to say for the moment now, the section underneath caregiver the section underneath caregiver protective capacities is broken down into 3 areas. They're broken down into the behavioral, the emotional, and the cognitive. So as we are out there working with our families and gathering the information, we are also writing down, as noted in the previous 6 domains, information that can lead us to assessing the behavioral, emotional, and cognitive, both enhanced, which are strengths, as well as diminished, or areas we need to work on, of their caregiver protective capacities. Okay, so as I mentioned before, when we've gathered all of this information, the danger threats, the information collection, the determination of what their protective capacities are, underneath their domains, as well as scaling it, that leads us to identify whether we have sufficient information to determine whether the child is safe or unsafe. While we're not going to go into depth what safe and unsafe looks like and means, I want to at least provide you with the definition of both safe and unsafe. For the child practice model, safe is identified when there is either no danger threat to the child or when there may be a danger threat. However, the caregivers have the caregiver protective capacities to manage that danger threat. Okay, so let me give you a very kind of high level and simple example. So a child can be considered safe when there's no danger threat at all. So when of those 10, because remember the 11th is really other, so when there is no danger threat, so there's no impulsive behaviors that are out of control, there are no other issues where the caregiver may not be taking care of the basic needs, or where there may be someone who is impulsive, but the caregiver has the protective capacities to manage that. So I will give an example. Again, it's not necessarily related to child welfare, but it just gives a clear example of a danger threat and protective capacities, or vice versa in our next one, unsafe. So a child is safe if I am walking with my child out in the parking lot to the car and there are no oncoming cars at all. So there are no threats of danger to my child being run over. So there is no danger threat. My child is safe in the parking lot with me as we go out to the car. Now, on the other hand, my child could also be safe if there is a danger threat. If I am going out into the parking lot and there are lots of cars driving back and forth. However, I have the protective capacities to reach over, firmly hold on to my child, make sure I'm verbalizing look both ways, make sure we are waiting on the side of the curb until the cars pass, waiting until the cars stop, waving our hands, walking by. So you get kind of a general idea of safe doesn't necessarily mean that there are no dangers out there. It just means that the caregivers who have the children have those protective capacities to ensure their safety. Now, again, that was a non-child welfare example, but I did just want to give you kind of an example so you can kind of see what this safe might look like. So applying it to the practice model again, it would be no danger threat of the 11 that we have, or there may be a danger threat, but there is a parent or a caregiver who has the protective capacities to manage that danger threat, so the child is still safe. On the other hand, the practice model indicates that the child is unsafe when there is a danger threat to a vulnerable child within a family or a home, and the caregiver does not have the protective capacity. So what this says here is the caregiver protective capacities are insufficient, or they're diminished, or they don't have them at all to manage the threat of danger. So thus it requires outside intervention. Okay, so in my very non-practice model example before, my child would be unsafe if I was coming outside and we were crossing into a parking lot to go to the car, and there were lots of cars driving back and forth, and I did nothing to reach out and ensure my child's safety. So my child had the ability to run freely into the street. I did not stop the child. I did not hold the child's hand for whatever particular reasons. Okay, so now that we've kind of done a very high level overview of what a family functioning assessment entails, or the components of it, and again, the overall process is to determine whether a child is safe or unsafe, we now go to what we call progress updates. A progress update is actually a family functioning assessment every 90 days or at critical junctures. Okay, so when we talk about the progress update, just as I mentioned, it contains the same components as the family functioning assessment because, again, it is an assessment to see where they're at. It's the progress since the previous 90 days or critical junctures, and it has one additional component. So let me just briefly go over. It has the danger, threat, and danger statement. That's in the FFA also. It has the domains that we talked about before, the child functioning, adult functioning, parenting, and discipline. If you notice, it does not include the maltreatment and surrounding circumstances because, again, remember that maltreatment and surrounding circumstances is only entered by the protective investigator. Will it still pull up? Yes, it will still pull up. But this slide here just shows you the components of what makes up the progress update. We are not adding additional information to the maltreatment and surrounding circumstances, but we should absolutely be going through that entire cycle of information collection and updating every one of these sections: child functioning, adult functioning, parenting, and discipline. And remember, parenting and discipline are combined together when you're looking at it. We also need to go through the information collection and get updates on the child's needs, as well as the CPCs. Remember, that is the caregiver protective capacities. And we need to continue to assess their stage and their motivation for change, as well as complete the ongoing safety analysis. Now, the new section in the progress update also includes what we are calling outcomes. Outcomes are the progress and the status of the services that we had identified were needed, and these outcomes come from the case plan that we work with the families. And again, like I said, we're not going to go into depth in the other areas. I just wanted to make sure that we were at least providing you with a very high level overview of what goes into the assessments. So I am now going to switch over and we're going to do a little deeper dive. Okay, we've basically gone over very high level the process and assessment to get the information for the FFAI, that's the Investigation Family Functioning Assessment, the FFAO, which is the initial family assessment that is completed by the case managers, as well as the information that goes into the progress update. So what we're going to do is we're going to now go into a deeper dive of the actual protective capacities, what that means, as well as the scaling that we in case management use to identify the enhanced and diminished protective capacities. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the caregiver protective capacities. Again, as mentioned, they are those personal and caregiving, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional characteristics that are specifically and directly associated with being protective of one's youth, of their children, not of each other, not of personal, but specific and directly associated with being protective of one's children, of one's young. And it's important, and this is why we bolded it, because as we go through and you actually get to see some of the CPCs and I go over some of the high-level titles, there are some, if you don't, when you're assessing, read them carefully. Sometimes people confuse the protective capacity to mean something else, just solely based upon the protective capacity title of itself. But when you think about it with respect to them being behavioral, cognitive, and emotionally able to associate that with protecting their children, then you start to understand the specific nuances that kind of lead you into obtaining some additional information on your families. Okay? These are the personal qualities or characteristics that contribute to being that vigilant child protector, that parent that is going to grab that child's hand on my totally non-practice model example earlier for my safe child. So, okay, you've seen this slide before, but I didn't go over the components within it because this is where we will be talking about a little more in depth. So, as previously mentioned, the caregiver protective capacities, and I'm probably going to refer them to as CPCs for the most part, are broken up into three components. The first one is behavioral, the second one is emotional, and the third one is cognitive. So what does that mean? Behavioral means the actions that they're doing. So below it has the following underneath behavioral protective capacities. And remember, this is all within respect of protecting their child. So are they demonstrating the ability to control any impulses that they have to protect their child? Are they taking action to protect their child? Are they setting aside their own needs for the protection of their child? Are they demonstrating behaviorally adequate skills to protect their child? Are they behaviorally adaptive in the protection of their child? And do they have a history of protecting their child? Now, I am going to let you know right now that each one of these protective capacities under each one of these sections has their own very specific identification of what a protective capacity would look like when it's enhanced, as well as to the degree, we call it scaling, as which it may be diminished. We do not have the time today to look at some of those specific scaling underneath each one of those, but I do just want to let you know that each one of those areas has very specific idea of what an enhanced protective capacity would look like, as well as when you're assessing it for an enhanced or diminished, specific categories or scaling as to what an A, B, C, or D will look like. And again, my apologies, because we'll get into the specifics later of the scaling. The second protective capacity is emotional. So that is, how are the parents feeling about their children? If you recall back when we were doing some of the other domains, it asked us to notate and to get information surrounding how do they perceive their children? Do they perceive them as a burden? Do they perceive them as something that is the light of their life? This is where the emotional component comes from. So again, I'm gonna go through each one of these, and it is as it relates to the protection of the child. So, are they meeting their own emotional needs for the protection of their child? Are they resilient so they can protect and for the protection of their child? Are they tolerant? Do they express love? Again, this is for their child. Are they emotionally stable enough for the protection of their child? Are they positively attached to their child? And are they aligned with their child? The third one is cognitive, and this talks to the caregiver protective capacities on how they are thinking. So the first one was behavioral, how they are acting. The second one is emotional, how they feel. And the third one is cognitive, so how are they thinking? And again, with the respect to the protection of their child. So are they self-aware? Are they intellectually able? See, and if you look at here, this is why I'm saying for the protection of their child, and is why we have it separated into three. Because over on the behavioral component, if you look a little more than halfway down, it says, do they have the adequate skills? Sometimes people tend to put the adequate skills and or confuse it with intellectually able. So this is why it's very important as we go out and see our families and assess them, that we look at what each one of these specific capacities is referring to and what is identified in the practice model to make that a sufficient protective capacity, or if we need to work on it. Underneath cognitive, we also need to get information as to whether or not they recognize the danger threats. Do they recognize their child's needs? Do they understand their protective role? And are they able to articulate, to verbalize a protection plan? So those are the caregiver protective capacities and the areas that they're in. Now, as I mentioned before, they are scaled. So in each one of those categories previously listed, there is a scaling to them. Now, as an overall concept, when you guys are reading the FFA, or when you guys are reading the progress update, they are categorized in 4 general overview areas. So if you see a parent that has an A, the overall category is that that protective capacity, that CPC, is functioning and it's not affecting the child's safety. If you see it as a B, that CPC is still functioning. At times it may have affected the conditions in the home, but not the child's safety. So basically, as you are looking at the assessment and you're scanning the CPCs, because they are scanned and they are in a kind of Excel type of looking box. So if you see anything that is listed as an A and B, overall, that parent in that particular area is functioning and the child is safe, or they are functioning. At times there may have been an issue, but it is not anything that is impacting the child's safety. So basically A's, B's, good. Now, there's also C's and D's. So overall, again, as you're scanning through the various behavioral, emotional, or cognitive specific CPCs, if there is something that's a C, overall it says it is diminished and at times it has affected the child's safety. D is where the CPC is diminished, but it's diminished to a level that it is pervasively affecting child safety. Okay, so again, A's and B's, good. C's and D's, we need to look at. Now, I do just want to let you know, as the protective investigator does their assessment, and if you happen to be getting a family functioning assessment investigative, you will not see A, B, C, or D. The investigative FFA only comes over and they only assess the domains as either yes, they have that protective capacity, or no, they do not. Okay, so I do just want to kind of put that out there, because you may be in a position where the first assessment you obtain is the family functioning assessment investigative from the investigator. And after you've taken this training, I don't want you to reach out and ask them where the A, B, C's, and D's are, because for the investigative FFA, the investigation, it only pulls over as a yes or no. So you will only see, yes, they have the CPC, no, they do not. When it pulls over to case management and it becomes the family functioning assessment ongoing or progress update, you will then see it scaled A, B, C, or D. Now, just to let you know, overall, and I have it here on this one, only C's and D's will appear in the case plan and will be addressed in the case plan. And it makes sense because A's and B's say that they have it. They may have slipped once or twice, you know, an accident, stressed out type of thing, but it's still assessed as an A and B. C's and D's are what we need to ensure that we address in the case plan so that we can provide them with services. Now, I also want to let you know that should there be a debate into which letter to scale, I have here CAs, and my apologies because I did not clarify what that acronym means. That means the child advocate or the case manager. They are advised to scale it conservatively. We are always advising them that if they are debating whether it should be a B or a C, we advise them to scale it conservatively lower, so C, and then to reassess during the next progress update when further information has been gathered. Okay, we would rather see the family move from a C and have their protective capacities demonstrated to be enhanced and move up to a B, rather than have them potentially be assessed as a B when in reality they really needed support. So they really should have been assessed as a C or a D. Now, the only other thing I kind of want to make note of before I go on to the next section is that when the PI's assessment information pulls over, all of the yeses are pulled over as a B. All of the no's are pulled over as a D. So again, that kind of leads into our advisement to our case management staff that when in doubt, just go ahead and conservatively scale them a little lower so that we can at least re-identify and reassess whether or not it is an accurate scaling when we meet with our family next. Now, I know I may have gone kind of fast, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but my hope is that we've at least given enough kind of information that for the next 2 slides, I'm going to be able to show you kind of a very high-level example of a family with diminished capacities, as well as what it would look like when they're enhanced. So again, with the very high level training and information that you just received, if we were to put that in action with this very broad and high level example, I'm hoping that you will see just in general what enhanced capacities might look like. So, on the example I have here, it has Brian and Sheila. They are 19-year-old parents of a newborn. Both adults are limited intellectually and they're socially immature. They have no knowledge or skill needed in providing basic care to the infant. They have also mishandled the infant and behave towards her like she is a doll. The parents lack the capacity to provide essential care, which is around the clock for the infant. So, before going to the next slide, this is where we're going to take just a brief moment, and I'm going to read back through just a few, again, not all, of some of the possible caregiver protective capacities that we absolutely need to make sure, based upon this, we get more information on. So underneath the first one, I'll just do as an example, for the behavioral. Underneath the behavioral, we have several protective capacities, including controls impulses, do they take action, do they set aside the needs, their own needs for their child, do they have adequate skills, are they adaptive, and do they have a history of protecting? Now, while you may not know, I have had the pleasure of working in the practice model for several years. So I can let you know, as an example, one of the areas, based again upon what is listed here. Underneath behavioral, it says, do they have adequate skills? So for this family, even though this information is very basic and we absolutely need to get more information, we do already know right now that their scaling underneath adequate skills is going to be either C or D. Again, as the case manager assessing the family, I cannot just simply say, oh, this is C or D. I have to refer to the actual protective capacity list, which very explicitly provides me with examples of what would cause me to scale it as a C or a D. Now, I would imagine that if I was the case manager working with this family, considering it does say that it is limited intellectually, socially immature, basic skills, mishandling the infant, acting as if she's like a doll, I would imagine that it's probably going to get me near a D. Again, though, it is not something for me to imagine. We have actual guides and references that we must use and must be demonstrated and noted in our information collection. All right, the next one I'm going to do is the emotional protective capacity area. Okay, so again, remember, underneath emotional, we have meeting your own emotional needs. Is the parent resilient? Are they tolerant? Do they express love? Are they emotionally stable? Are they positively attached to the child? And are they aligned to the child? All right, let's look at this example again. They're 19, they're limited intellectually, socially immature, no knowledge or skill, mishandled the infant, behaved toward her like she is a doll, lack the capacity to provide essential care that is around the clock for an infant. You know what? I'm going to tell you, that one's pretty tough because, again, underneath emotional, it is whether or not the parent is able to meet their own needs. You know, it does say here they're intellectually and socially immature, but is it to the extent that they can't meet their own needs for the protection of their child? I'm not sure, possibly. But again, we need to go back to the very specific set of guidelines and the references that we use. We cannot, based upon this information, simply scale any of those categories, okay? So I just wanted to kind of let you know, do we have an idea of where we may need to focus some extra questions and information collection just so that we have a better understanding and can appropriately identify diminished capacities? Absolutely. But in the same respect, it is also our responsibility to go through each one of those protective capacities and work with our families to also identify, hey, are there some of these protective capacities that are enhanced? Are there some that they are doing well? If that's the case, we also need to recognize those, okay? So let's go through this last one. This last one is the cognitive area of protective capacities. And these specific protective capacities underneath the cognitive area are they self-aware? Are they intellectually able? Do they recognize threats? Do they recognize the child's needs? Do they understand the protective role? And are they able to articulate a protection plan? So for the cognitive one, again, we really probably need more information to identify what is going on as far as if there are some strengths maybe in this area of cognition, or is there some strengths in the area of their emotional or behavioral protective capacities. I know when we've done this scenario in the past and we've talked about it, we had been a little hard pressed to find an enhanced capacity, but again, remember, I'm staring down at 4 or 5 sentences, which is why it's very important for us to understand and really get all the information that we can around information collection. So, what we're going to say is that before I go to the next page, is that we're going to say that the protective investigator did their first initial assessment, and then the case management did their assessment appropriately. We're going to imagine that they've identified both the strengths, the enhanced protective capacities, as well as the diminished ones. We're going to imagine that they've worked with this family to identify their goals. We've worked with them to identify their stages of change. And we're going to imagine that we've worked with them as well so that we can identify the specific diminished capacities and what the capacities would look like when they're enhanced. So what does that mean? So what that means is on the next slide that I'm about to show you, these are some examples of if these changes were able to be demonstrated, remember, behavioral, felt, emotional, or stated, which is the cognitive, by the parents, then the child, if consistently demonstrated and observed, could potentially be identified at a later and ongoing date as having parents who have the enhanced protective capacities to care for their child, even if the danger threat continues. So, working with our parents. If we had parental changes for these 2 persons we just saw, it would look like this. So imagine those 2 19-year-olds before. If they were able to handle the infant gently, carefully, and understand the importance of doing so, that would cover some of the areas that were diminished in the prior example. The next one, parents have a plan for providing basic care. They understand the plan, they can describe what they will do, and generally understand why it is necessary. And the parents understand their responsibilities as parents. They can identify what the consequences to the infant might be if they do not do what is best for her. Now, when you look at these are the parental changes for this particular family that would be needed for this child to be safe. Might there be others? There might be. This actual scenario from the previous slide and this one were actually provided to us as minimum basic changes in child protective or in caregiver protective capacities that we were given by the Children's Legal Services, the Office of the Attorney General, the counsel and the attorneys that are working in child welfare. Okay, so these, again, it's not just one change and we're good. For the high level example that we had here, these are the 3 minimum things that would need to be changed and enhanced in the parental capacities in order for the child to be safe. And if you look at it, it is absolutely demonstrating in their 3 areas of behavioral, emotional, and cognitive. I have a few moments here before my last slide, so I do just again want to reiterate and say thank you very, very much for participating. I really appreciate it. Your agency appreciates it. And again, this is very high level. If there are any areas in which you may need additional information, I'm sure you will have the opportunity. But again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I'm glad I had the opportunity to provide you with an overview of the child welfare practice model and specifically with the focus of the caregiver protective capacities.